Most people misunderstand what an empath's presence actually does in a room. They assume it's warmth or kindness or some heightened form of emotional sensitivity. And while those elements are there, they are not the core mechanism at work. What defines that presence is perception, a kind of unfiltered awareness that doesn't rely on what is said, but on what is revealed between what is said. And once you begin to notice that, you start to see why it creates tension without ever turning into open conflict. I've watched this happen in situations that, on the surface, looked completely ordinary. A conversation moving smoothly, polite exchanges, the right words being used at the right time, nothing visibly wrong, but then there's a moment, almost too subtle to register unless you're paying attention, where something doesn't align. A person says they're fine, but their breathing tightens just slightly. They smile, but the muscles around the eyes don't follow. There's a delay before they respond. Not long enough to call it hesitation, but long enough to signal that something is being managed internally. Most people move past that without a second thought. An empath doesn't, and here's where it becomes uncomfortable, not because anything is being exposed out loud, but because something is being recognized internally. When you consistently pick up on those discrepancies, you're no longer interacting with just the words someone is offering. You're interacting with the version of themselves they're trying to hold together. That changes the dynamic in a way that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. People sense when they are being perceived beyond the surface. Even if they can't articulate how or why, it creates a kind of quiet pressure. The awareness that something about them is being seen more clearly than they intended. What most people do with that pressure is not curiosity. They don't pause and ask themselves what part of their experience is leaking through, or why they feel slightly exposed in the presence of someone who hasn't actually confronted them. Instead, the discomfort looks for direction, and it usually moves outward. I've seen individuals shift their tone without realizing it, become slightly dismissive, inject sarcasm where there was none before, or create distance in ways that seem disproportionate to the interaction itself. From the outside, it can look confusing, even random, but it isn't random. It's a reaction to something internal that was brought closer to the surface, and this is the part that often gets misinterpreted. The empath didn't do anything in the conventional sense. There was no accusation, no challenge, no attempt to disrupt. The disruption came from what their awareness represented. When someone spends enough time managing their internal state through avoidance or carefully constructed self-perception, any presence that cuts through that, even quietly, can feel destabilizing, not because it's aggressive, but because it's accurate. Over time, this creates a pattern that most empaths learn to recognize. Even if they can't always explain it immediately, they notice that certain people become uneasy around them without a clear reason, that interactions carry an undercurrent that wasn't initiated by anything explicit, that being fully present in their natural awareness seems to shift the emotional temperature of the room. And the question that tends to follow is a difficult one because it sounds like self-doubt on the surface. Is it something I'm doing wrong? Or is it something they're not ready to see? The answer rarely announces itself directly, but the pattern leaves enough evidence if you're willing to look at it without softening it. There's a point where what feels like connection begins to shift into something else, and most people don't recognize the transition when it happens. It doesn't arrive as a clear change in behavior or a sudden imbalance you can easily name in. It builds quietly through repeated interactions, where one person is consistently understood without having to offer the same level of understanding in return. And if you're wired to listen deeply, to read between lines, to stabilize emotional tension almost instinctively, you become very easy to lean on in ways that don't look like dependence at first glance. I've seen this pattern unfold in conversations that start with genuine openness. Someone shares something personal. You respond with clarity, not just acknowledging what they said, but what they meant, what they avoided, what they didn't fully understand about themselves yet. There's relief in that moment, a kind of exhale they didn't realize they were holding, and that relief can feel like connection, because it's rare for someone to feel that accurately understood, but what follows is where the structure reveals itself. They come back, not just to talk, but to offload. The conversations become less about exchange and more about release, less about mutual awareness and more about one person finding stability through the other. At first, it feels meaningful. It feels like you're providing something real, something that helps, something that brings order to emotional confusion, and in many ways, you are, but meaning doesn't automatically equal balance. When one person is consistently providing clarity and the other is consistently receiving it, a subtle shift begins to take place. The relationship stops being defined by who each person is and starts being defined by what one person supplies. Attention becomes expected, insight becomes assumed, your presence becomes a kind of emotional infrastructure they rely on without fully recognizing the cost of maintaining it. What makes this dynamic difficult to detect is that it doesn't feel exploitative in the beginning. There's often appreciation, even gratitude. But over time, that gratitude fades into familiarity, and familiarity into entitlement. I've watched people who once expressed genuine appreciation slowly adjust their expectations. Not consciously, but behaviorally, they begin to assume availability, to expect the same level of patience, the same depth of response, the same emotional steadiness regardless of context. And when that expectation isn't met, even slightly, the reaction isn't confusion, it's frustration. Not because something wrong happened, but because something they relied on wasn't there in the way they had grown used to. That's when the illusion becomes harder to ignore, because connection, real connection, doesn't create a dependency that collapses under minor changes. It adapts. It recalibrates. It moves toward mutual awareness. Need, on the other hand, resists that shift. It tightens when access is reduced. It becomes reactive when the flow is interrupted. It reveals itself through the discomfort it generates when the structure is no longer one-directional. And if you've been in that position long enough, you start to notice something else. The more you give in those dynamics, the less clearly you are seen as a person. You are experienced as a function, as a source, as something that exists to restore balance that isn't yours to maintain. That realization doesn't usually arrive all at once. It accumulates through small moments where you pause before responding, where you notice the absence of reciprocity, where you feel the weight of being consistently available in ways that aren't returned. What looked like depth begins to reveal its actual shape, and it doesn't match what it once felt like. There's a moment, and it rarely arrives with any kind of announcement, when the awareness you've been carrying starts to turn inward instead of outward. Up until that point, most of your attention has been directed at understanding others, stabilizing what feels unstable, translating what isn't being said into something coherent. But eventually, the imbalance becomes too consistent to ignore, and what you've been observing in others begins to reflect back as a question about your own position in the dynamic, not in a dramatic way, not with confrontation, but as a quiet recalibration that changes how you engage without needing to explain why. I've seen this shift happen in very small, almost unnoticeable ways. A message that doesn't get an immediate response, not out of avoidance, but out of choice. A conversation where you listen, but don't automatically step in to organize someone else's emotions. A pause where there used to be a reflex. These aren't acts of withdrawal, they're acts of definition. And the difference between those two is something most people don't recognize until the effects begin to surface, because when you stop filling space the way you used to, the space itself becomes more visible, and what's been sitting inside it, the structure of the relationship, starts to reveal its actual form. Boundaries, in their most accurate sense, don't push people away. They remove the assumption of unlimited access. They shift the interaction from automatic to intentional. And once that shift happens, you start to see how much of the connection was built on availability rather than mutual awareness. I've watched people who seemed entirely comfortable suddenly become uncertain when the rhythm changes, not because anything was taken from them unfairly, but because something they never questioned is no longer guaranteed. The consistency they relied on is interrupted. And that interruption exposes what was underneath it. What becomes clear, often faster than expected, is that not every relationship was structured to hold balance. Some were built around the predictability of your responses, your patience, your ability to make sense of what others couldn't. When that predictability is no longer automatic, the reaction doesn't always come in direct language. It shows up in tone, in timing, in subtle shifts that indicate something is being tested. I've seen people repeat the same patterns just slightly differently, as if trying to find the version that will reopen the same level of access. It's not always conscious, but it's consistent enough to recognize once you stop adjusting yourself to accommodate it. And this is where the internal conflict tends to surface, because you can feel the difference immediately. You can sense the tension, the slight misalignment, the unspoken expectation that things should return to how they were. There's an instinct to smooth it over, to explain, to reassure, to step back into the role that kept everything stable. But stability built on imbalance doesn't correct itself. It depends on you maintaining it. The moment you stop doing that, the responsibility shifts. And that shift is where the true nature of the relationship becomes visible without needing to be pointed out. Nothing dramatic needs to happen for that clarity to settle in. It doesn't require confrontation or even agreement. The pattern speaks for itself. Once the conditions change, once access begins to change, even slightly, something very predictable starts to surface, and it rarely looks like what people expect. It doesn't come across as a clear acknowledgement of the shift, and it almost never sounds like, "I notice you've set a boundary." Instead, it shows up as resistance, but not the kind that declares itself openly. It's quieter than that, more adaptive, and often disguised as confusion, disappointment, or subtle reinterpretation of your behavior. And if you've been paying attention long enough, you can watch the transition happen in real time. The moment where someone realizes that the version of you they had access to is no longer fully available. I've seen this unfold in conversations where nothing explicit was said about change, yet the reaction made it obvious that something had been felt. The tone shifts just slightly. Questions become more probing. not out of curiosity, but as a way to test the limits of what's still accessible. There's a kind of recalibration happening on their side, an attempt to locate where the boundaries are now and whether they are fixed or flexible. Sometimes it's direct, framed as concern or observation. Comments like, "You seem different lately," or "You're not as open as you used to be." Other times, it's indirect, a change in responsiveness, a withdrawal that mirrors your own adjustment, but carries a different intention behind it. What looks like distance is often an attempt to reestablish control over a dynamic that no longer operates the way it once did. The critical detail here is that people don't react to boundaries based on their logic or fairness. They react based on what those boundaries remove. If someone has grown accustomed to unrestricted access to your time, your attention, your emotional steadiness, then even a modest limitation can feel significant. Not because it is unreasonable, but because it interrupts a pattern they have come to rely on without ever having to question it. And when that pattern is disrupted, the response is not always adaptation. For many, it is resistance. And that resistance often takes the form of reframing your behavior in a way that reduces the discomfort they're experiencing. I've watched individuals take qualities they once valued and reinterpret them almost seamlessly. Your consistency becomes rigidity. Your clarity becomes overanalysis. Your calm becomes detachment. These shifts in perception don't happen because your behavior has become extreme. They happen because the function your behavior served for them has changed. What once provided stability now introduces limitation. And that limitation forces them to engage with themselves in ways they may not be prepared for. Instead of moving inward to address that, the easier route is to move outward and assign meaning to your change that protects their position. There's also a more subtle layer that becomes visible if you look closely enough. Some people will begin to test the boundary, not in a confrontational way, but through repetition. They reintroduce familiar patterns, similar requests, the same emotional cues that used to produce a predictable response from you. It's almost procedural, like running a sequence they know used to work, watching to see if the outcome has changed. And when it doesn't, when the boundary holds without explanation or apology, the reaction deepens. Frustration may not be expressed directly, but it starts to accumulate beneath the surface, influencing tone, timing, and engagement in ways that are difficult to articulate but easy to feel. This is where the internal challenge becomes more demanding than the external one, because you can sense all of it. You can feel the shift in energy, the unspoken tension, the quiet pushback that doesn't announce itself but is present in every interaction. And there's a part of you that recognizes how easily it could be resolved, not by discussion, but by returning to what was familiar, by softening the boundary just enough to restore the previous rhythm. That option is always there. And that's what makes this stage so revealing. Because every time you choose not to take it, every time you allow the discomfort to exist without trying to neutralize it, you reinforce something that didn't exist before, a structure that isn't dependent on your constant adjustment. What becomes clear, without needing to be stated directly, is that the resistance was never about misunderstanding. It was about losing access to something that no longer belongs to the dynamic in the same way. And once that loss is felt, the relationship either reorganizes itself around the new reality, or it begins to show signs that it was never built to function without that level of availability. There comes a stage where the shift is no longer about what you give or what you withhold. And it isn't even about the boundaries themselves. It's about the internal alignment that begins to settle into place once you stop negotiating your own awareness. Up until then, most of the changes have been behavioral. You respond differently, you engage with more precision, you choose where your attention goes with more care, but eventually something deeper stabilizes, and that stability changes how you experience everything around you. It becomes less about managing dynamics and more about recognizing which ones are no longer compatible with who you've become. I've seen this happen in people who didn't make any dramatic declarations, didn't cut ties abruptly, didn't announce a transformation, but simply stopped relating in the same way. The conversations they tolerated before no longer held the same weight. The emotional patterns they used to absorb without hesitation now felt unnecessary to carry. There was no hostility in the shift, no need to correct anyone or point out what had changed, just a quiet consistency in how they moved, what they engaged with, and what they allowed to pass without involvement. And what stood out wasn't the change itself, but the contrast it created for those who were still operating within the old dynamic. Because growth doesn't exist in isolation, it reveals itself through difference. The way you listen changes. The way you respond changes. The urgency to fix, to explain, to maintain emotional equilibrium for others begins to dissolve, not because you no longer understand, but because you no longer assume responsibility for what was never yours to regulate. And for someone who has come to rely on that version of you, this shift doesn't register as alignment. It registers as distance, not because you've become distant, but because the structure they were used to no longer exists in the same form. I've watched people try to make sense of this in ways that protect their own position. They don't usually recognize it as growth, they reinterpret it. What used to feel grounding now feels unavailable. What used to feel like support now feels selective. And in that reinterpretation, something important gets obscured. The fact that nothing essential has been removed, only redistributed. The same awareness is there, the same capacity to understand, the same ability to connect, but it's no longer extended indiscriminately. It's directed with intention, and that intention creates a natural filter that wasn't present before. This is where the cost becomes visible, not as something dramatic or immediate, but as a gradual separation between what aligns and what no longer does. Some relationships adjust, they recalibrate, sometimes slowly, sometimes with initial resistance, but eventually they meet you at a level that reflects a shared willingness to evolve. Others don't. They remain anchored in the version of you that was more accessible, more available, more consistent in ways that required less from them. And when that version is no longer present, the connection begins to lose its structure. Not because it was broken, but because it was never built to adapt. There's a moment in this process that tends to go unnoticed unless you're paying very close attention. It's the point where you stop trying to translate your growth into something others can comfortably accept. You stop adjusting your language, your behavior, your level of engagement to reduce the contrast they feel, not out of indifference, but out of clarity. Because the more you attempt to minimize that difference, the more you distort the very alignment that made the growth possible in the first place. And distortion, even when it's subtle, pulls you back into patterns you've already moved beyond. What replaces that tendency is something quieter but far more stable. A willingness to let people interpret you based on their current capacity without needing to correct it, without needing to bring them to the same level of understanding. You begin to recognize that being fully understood is not a requirement for being internally consistent, and once that recognition settles, the pressure to maintain every connection starts to fade. not because connection loses its value, but because misaligned connection loses its hold. The result isn't isolation, and it isn't detachment in the way it's often described. It's a different kind of presence, one that doesn't depend on constant exchange or validation to feel grounded. You still see what's there. You still understand what's beneath the surface, but the need to engage with all of it, to participate in every dynamic, to remain accessible in every situation, that begins to fall away. What remains is a more deliberate way of moving through relationships, one that reflects not just your ability to perceive, but your decision about where that perception is allowed to land. And from that position, the pattern that once felt confusing becomes easier to read without needing to resolve it.